Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're doing a really crucial deep dive into the Black Book of Communism. This is a work that meticulously looks at the history, the impact of communist regimes across the globe. And it really focuses on the stark reality, the repression, the terror, the immense human cost.
It's a powerful book. Controversial, maybe, but powerful. It examines how this ideology, supposedly about humanism and liberation, well, how it actually resulted in mass killings, forced labor, and just systematic suppression and dissent on a scale that's hard to comprehend.
It really forces you to confront that paradox, doesn't it?
That's absolutely.
And a few key themes jump out right away when you read it. First, that stark contrast, like you said, between the ideals communism claimed and the brutal reality of how it was implemented.
Definitely. And second, there's that really complex comparison with Nazi atrocity.
Yeah, the quantitative versus qualitative thing, scale versus the unique nature of the evil.
Exactly. And third, you see this disturbing consistency of violence. It's just there as a core tool of political control across so many different communist states, different times, different places.
It's baked in, almost.
It seems that way. And the book details the specific mechanisms they used, right? The secret police operating without checks, purges, getting rid of anyone seen as an enemy. Then there's forced collectivization, engineered famines, things that had devastating impacts.
And just crushing any kind of opposition, however small.
Any perceived opposition, yeah. And finally, the book touches on the legacy, the long shadow these regimes cast, and how societies are still trying to reckon with it all.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to explore these themes. We'll try to follow the book's structure chronologically to really understand how communism's darker side unfolded.
Sounds good. Where do we begin?
Let's start right at the beginning. The Bolshevik Revolution, early Soviet terror, say 1917 to 1922.
Okay. The book argues that right after the revolution, there's this critical moment. You have this spontaneous social violence, which maybe you'd expect after such upheaval. But the key thing is, it gets channeled, formalized. It becomes part of the state structure itself.
Right. It's not just chaos, it's organized violence.
Institutionalized violence, yes. That's a crucial step.
And the book points to something specific, this deliberate offensive against the peasantry, starting around spring 1918. It says this wasn't just putting down random resistance.
No, it presents it as more of a deliberate strategy, a kind of template for the terror that would come later.
How so?
Well, the forceful taking of food, grain requisitioning, it naturally sparked resistance in the countryside. The Bolshevik response was extreme force, ruthless. And this set a precedent. Any opposition gets crushed, even if it means widespread suffering.
Prioritizing the state's goals over people's basic survival.
Precisely. It established that pattern early on. Chilling, really.
And this is when the Cheka emerges, right? The All-Russian Extraordinary Commission.
Yes. And it might have looked kind of modest at first. Limited scope. Temporary, maybe.
But the book shows how quickly it expanded, how it became this central, terrifying instrument of state terror.
And what's insightful is how its power, which was sort of justified by the revolution and the Civil War, just became permanent, unchecked. So creating this unaccountable secret police so early really laid the groundwork for, everything that followed under Stalin and beyond.
The book also talks about Lenin's role, how he explicitly encouraged social revenge among the people.
Yeah, framing it as part of a just civil war. That rhetoric, the book argues, basically legitimized violence against whole categories of people, class enemies.
That ideological justification is key, isn't it?
Absolutely crucial. If you frame violence as morally right, necessary for this utopian future, well, then you can rationalize almost anything.
And we see that pattern again and again in the book.
We do.
It wasn't just active opponents either. The book details how quickly they suppressed dissent within the revolutionary movement. Non-Bolshevik papers, Soviets that weren't towing the party line.
Gone. It shows this core principle. Consolidate power. Quickly. No challenges allowed.
So much for the idea of grassroots power through the Soviets.
That got subverted very fast. Centralized party control took over.
And the food requisitioning, that led to peasant uprisings.
Inevitably.
Yeah.
Which, as the book documents, were met with extreme violence.
And it's here, in this early stage, we see the beginnings of the concentration camp system.
Yes, the ominous start. The book makes a distinction, though it was often blurry in reality, between coercive work camps and concentration camps.
But either way,
there were tools for repression. Isolating enemies, forced labor, inhuman conditions. It's the precursor to the Gulag, really. this system of locking people up outside the legal process.
And shockingly, the book says even worker protests, strikes the very people the Bolsheviks claim to represent, they were crushed.
Yeah, brutally. And the threat of these camps is used to silence them.
It just highlights that disconnect, doesn't it,
Yeah.
between the promises and the reality of their rule.
A fundamental disconnect, right from the start. Power retention was clearly the priority.
The repression also hit other socialist parties, like the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Mensheviks.
Even when there weren't formal bans, their members were targeted, arrested, persecuted. It just shows the Bolsheviks' intolerance for any alternative.
No room for political pluralism.
None. Setting the stage for the one-party states that became the norm.
And the sheer scale of the violence, even in those first few years, it's horrifying. Mass executions, the book mentions even drownings.
It paints a very stark picture. The methods used to solidify control were incredibly brutal.
So this early terror really laid the foundation, didn't it?
You could say it prototyped it all. The methods, the justifications, the institutions of repression, they were all there, in essence, right after the revolution, ready for Stalin to build upon.
Okay, let's move forward then to the early 1930s, Stalin's era. The book details forced collectivization and dekulakization.
Right, a truly devastating period. Stalin's goal was to wipe out private farms, force everyone onto collective state-controlled ones. And the kulaks, this vaguely defined group of supposedly richer peasants, they became the scapegoats, the targets.
And the book really stresses how arbitrary that kulak label was.
Oh, absolutely. It could be based on almost anything. Vindictive accusations, flimsy reasons. Millions suffered unjustly because of it.
What happened to them?
Mass deportations. Millions of people, entire families, forcibly moved to remote, often uninhabitable regions, Siberia, Kazakhstan. The conditions were just horrific. Mass death from cold, hunger, disease. The book documents some truly awful things, even cannibalism born out of sheer desperation.
Unimaginable. And this is when the Gulag system really expands massively.
Yes. The network of forced labor camps becomes huge. Places like the Solovetsky Islands gain notoriety for their brutality.
So the Gulag wasn't just for punishment?
No, it became a massive economic engine, a huge pool of forced labor for building canals, logging, mining, construction projects. But the conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to break people. Illness, death rates were incredibly high. The human cost is just staggering.
There's a chilling detail the book mentions. How many of those dekulakized people were later brought back into society, but as forced laborers.
Right. Not free, just exploited differently. It shows how the system saw people as just resources, cogs in the machine. Their lives meant nothing compared to the state's goals.
Just complete dehumanization.
Exactly.
And then, layered on top of this upheaval, comes the Great Famine, 1932-1933, Ukraine, other areas.
And the book is crystal clear. This was not a natural disaster. It was man-made, a direct result of state policies.
How so?
The forced seizure of grain, taking everything, even the seed needed for the next harvest. It created this catastrophe. Millions starved while the state kept taking food even as people were dying in huge numbers.
The book describes this awful silence falling over villages as people just died, too weak even to protest.
And Stalin's reaction. Dismissing it, calling reduced grain deliveries a kulak strike. It just underscores the regime's absolute culpability.
Or refusal to even acknowledge the tragedy they'd created.
That engineered famine, the Holodomor in Ukraine, it's just such a stark example of ideology and ruthlessness leading to horror.
Okay, so moving into the mid-1930s now, the book chronicles the descent into the purges, the Great Terror.
Yeah, an intensification of repression. It wasn't just ordinary people anymore. It reached deep into the Communist Party itself. Intellectuals, anyone seen as a potential threat to Stalin's absolute grip on power.
And the assassination of Kirov in 1934, the book suggests that was the pretext.
A catalyst, or more likely, yes, a pretext. The book strongly implies Stalin might have orchestrated it to eliminate rivals and justify widening the purges.
And then came the show trials.
Yes, these meticulously staged events, unmasking supposed counter-revolutionaries, getting forced confessions. It was all theater, but deadly theater.
Even prominent old Bolsheviks, people who'd been there from the start, got caught up in it.
No one was safe. These trials weren't about justice. They were about eliminating opposition and creating this pervasive climate of fear and paranoia. Public spectacles of state power.
It took decades for the full scale to come out, right? Khrushchev's secret report.
Exactly. That finally confirmed what many suspected, the sheer scale of arbitrary arrests, torture, executions under Stalin. The book highlights the NKVD, the secret police, being given quotas.
Quotas for arrests and execution.
Yes. It turned into this macabre bureaucratic exercise. Local units had to meet targets, often leading them to just round up innocent people indiscriminately to fill the numbers.
And the troikas the book describes.
These three-person tribunals, they completely bypassed any normal legal process. Swift, arbitrary sentences, often death sentences. Justice was just a rubber stamp.
Who are they targeting by this point?
The net kept widening. Former kulaks, ex-criminals, czarist officials, members of other parties, even loyal party members who just fell under suspicion for some reason.
Anyone, basically.
Anyone could become an enemy.
And Stalin's justification. It's chilling that the nearer we come to socialism, the more the enemies fight back.
It's twisted logic, isn't it? It rationalized eliminating anyone seen as an obstacle, however imaginary. This idea of a constant struggle against internal enemies became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The regime basically manufactured threats to justify its own brutality.
Precisely.
And the Gulag population during this time.
It swelled dramatically. The book says nearly 2 million by 1941, which, ironically, made the camps less productive economically.
Because conditions were so bad.
Overcrowding, disease, brutality, death rates soared. And it was all underpinned by Article 58 of the Penal Code. This vague charge of counter-revolutionary activities was used to imprison millions.
So the terror regime just kept growing. Then the book shifts focus again to World War II and after Soviet expansion.
Right, and it shows how the Soviet model of repression was basically exported to the territories they took over in Eastern Europe.
After the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yes. Annexing parts of Poland, the Baltic states, this expansion came with systematic repression, mass arrests, deportations. Poles, especially, were targeted as hostile elements sent to Siberia.
And the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
They faced immediate, brutal Sovietization. The book details how anti-Soviet elements were targeted, national identity suppressed.
It wasn't just based on nationality, though, was it? The book mentions entire ethnic groups being deported.
Yes, collective punishment on a massive scale. Germans, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, others. Accused, often baselessly, of disloyalty during the war. Forcibly deported with incredible cruelty.
And the Gulag remained central.
Absolutely. Long prison sentences for political prisoners became even more common, and even after finishing a sentence, many faced continued exile or their sentences were just arbitrarily extended, kept within the system.
Did people resist inside the camps?
The book does note that, yes, despite the fear, the brutality, there was resistance. Strikes, hunger strikes, even riots sometimes. It shows that human spirit still flickered, even in those conditions.
Towards the end of Stalin's life, things like the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee affair, the doctor's plot. The book suggests these hinted at more purges to come.
It certainly seemed that way. It showed the paranoia was still there, right at the top.
Yeah.
Even high-ranking officials weren't safe from Stalin's suspicion and the terror machine he'd built.
Okay, so after covering the Soviet Union in such depth, the book then broadens out. It looks at how this pattern of terror spread.
Yes. Across Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa. It's a really sobering account of how this ideology, adapted in different ways, led to similar kinds of brutality almost everywhere it took root.
So Eastern Europe, after World War II.
Communist regimes imposed, often with the Red Army's backing. And then, predictably, purges, show trials mirroring the Soviet ones. Opposition parties, intellectuals, religious groups, especially the Catholic Church, were targeted.
The book mentions some particularly horrific things, like re-education in places like Patay prison in Romania.
Unimaginable psychological and physical torture used to break people. Just horrific. And when people did rise up hungry in '56, Prague in '68, they were crushed with overwhelming force.
And even after Stalin, the repression continued.
De-Stalinization didn't mean the end of political trials or repression in many of these countries, no.
Turning to Asia, the book covers China extensively.
Yes, a huge section. The violent land redistribution campaign early on, then the Great Leap Forward, the catastrophic famine it caused.
Millions died in that famine too, right?
Millions. Then the Cultural Revolution, more purges, chaos, widespread violence. And China had its own vast forced labor camp system, the Laogai. Plus, the book details the repression in Tibet.
And North Korea.
Presented as just this chillingly complete totalitarian state. Brutal prison camps, absolutely no dissent allowed, even kidnappings and assassinations abroad, sponsored by the state.
Vietnam and Laos, too.
After reunification of Vietnam, there was harsh repression, re-education camps. In Laos, internment camps, even for the royal family.
But perhaps the most extreme example the book covers is Cambodia.
Under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, it's described as one of the most radical, genocidal applications of communist ideology ever.
What did they do?
forcibly evacuated the entire capital, Phnom Penh, systematic mass killings, abolished money, private property, tried to destroy all existing social structures, family, religion, education, targeted specific groups like intellectuals, ethnic minorities. The result was the death of, what, a quarter of the population? Maybe more. It's just an absolute illustration of ideological extremism pushed to its horrifying limit.
Even in Latin America, the book finds examples.
Yes, Cuba, under Castro repression of opponents, forced labor camps for a time. Nicaragua, under the Sandinistas repression. The DGSE, secret police. The scale might have been different, but the pattern of controlling dissent was there.
And Africa.
Regimes often aligned with communist powers. Ethiopia, under Mengistu, terrible repression, famine. Angola, Mozambique, internal conflicts fueled by ideology. Afghanistan, of course, the Soviet intervention and the terror that accompanied it.
So after documenting all this across the globe, the book gets to the comparisons, particularly with Nazism.
Right. And its main argument, quantitatively, is that communism, despite its humanist claims, actually resulted in a greater number of deaths, a larger scale of totalitarian crime than Nazism did.
That's the numbers argument.
That's the numbers argument. But the book does acknowledge the counter-argument.
Which focuses on the Holocaust.
Exactly. Emphasizing the unique, industrialized, racially motivated nature of the Nazi genocide, a qualitative difference that many see as making it a singular evil, regardless of numbers.
The book also raises that unsettling idea, mass murder in the name of a noble ideal being somehow more perverse.
It touches on that, yes, the perversion of utopian goals, and it consistently highlights how communist rhetoric used dehumanizing language for its enemies. That was key to enabling the atrocities.
So ultimately, the book paints a picture of this vast, devastating impact of communist terror and the long, difficult process societies face in coming to terms with it.
A dark history, often deliberately buried or forgotten, that needs to be confronted.
So reflecting on all this evidence laid out in the Black Book of Communism, it really makes you think, what are the enduring lessons here about the dangers of these all-encompassing ideologies, the ones that promise utopia but demand total control?
And how vital it is to safeguard individual rights and freedoms against that kind of state power.
Absolutely. And how should societies even now grapple with these legacies, this history of widespread violence and repression? It's not ancient history for many places.
These are huge, critical questions. The Black Book, for all its difficulty and harrowing detail, is such an important historical record. A vital warning, really, about how even seemingly noble ideas can twist into something truly brutal.
Thank you for joining us for this very intense deep dive into the Black Book of Communism. We really encourage you to explore this challenging history further. Until our next deep dive on Books and Bytes.